Greetings, Dr. Jerome. Our group will present the relationship between the gross domestic product, GDP, inflation, exchange rates, and the foreign direct investment, FDI, in Malaysia. Our group consists of five members, which are Dayang Nur Abidah, Nora Shikin, Nurul Diana Zahirah, Ahmad Zahid, and Azrul Hazim. Without further ado, we will begin the presentation.
Hi and a very good morning to our lecturer Sir Gerald. Today our group will present about our project, the relationship between gross domestic, GDP, inflation, exchange rates and foreign direct investment, FDI in Malaysia. I, Azrul, will start our presentation with introduction. As we know that the performance of a nation economy is greatly influenced by a number of important aspects in the complicated world of international economy, such as GDP, inflation, exchange rates, and FDI. Gross domestic product or GDP, a crucial indication of economic output and of the general health of country economy, especially Malaysia. Inflation is an overall increase in the cost of goods and service over time. According to the Barrow 1995, inflation is the determinant of economic growth, which have the further explained that if there is high inflation, then the level of investment will reduce. According to the Bank Negara Malaysia, exchange rate is index measuring ringgit performance, whereby change in exchange rate can have an effect on price competitive Malaysia, export and import, which have impact on GDP growth. FDI is the category of international investment that reflect the objective of obtaining a lasting interest by an investor in one economic in an enterprise resident in another country, whereby economic growth has benefit from FDI due to the ability to attract the investor. For objective part, we spread into two parts, general and specific. For general part, our objective is to investigate the relationship between GDP, inflation, exchange rate, and foreign direct investment. For the specific part, first, our objective is to analyze a panel dataset spanning multiple countries from 1991 to 2021, collected from World Bank and UNCTAD, UCAD, in order to examine the relationship between GDP, inflation, exchange rate, and FDI. Second objective, to employ OLS regression and various statistical tests to evaluate the relationship between GDP and its independent variable. Third, to access the model fit and statistical significance in capturing the relationship between GDP, inflation, exchange rate, and foreign direct investment. And lastly, to examine the functional form of the variable and determine the impact on the relationship under investigation.
The relationship between GDP, inflation, exchange rates, and FDI has been extensively studied in the field of economy. This literature review examines the existing research on this relationship, highlighting key findings and identifying research gaps. Firstly is the relationship between GDP and inflation. Using co-integration and error correction models, Malik and Kodri 2001 find a long-run positive relationship between GDP growth rate and inflation for 4 South ASEAN countries. Gokal and Hanif 2004 review several different economic theories to develop consensus on the inflation and growth relationship for the economy of Fiji. Their results show that a weak negative correlation exists between inflation and growth, while the change in output gap bears significant bearing Umar and Ullah 2013 India study, which is to examine the impact of inflation on GDP and unemployment rate in Pakistan, has concluded that inflation insignificantly influenced GDP and unemployment, and the correlation is negative. Next is the relationship between GDP and exchange rate. Samuel and Nurina 2015 India study indicates that from the result on the effect of the inner wave between exchange rate against GDP generate a path coefficient of 0.214 with a t-statistic of 3.477, which is greater than the value of constant 1.96. There is a significant positive effect on GDP between exchange rate or exchange rate when GDP increase also increase. While the study that conducted by Idris 2019 found that gross domestic product GDP and official exchange rate of naira to dollar in Nigeria have long-run relationship but not statistically significant. That is, the official exchange rate and the gross domestic product GDP move together in the long run, but the movement is not significant. And lastly is the relationship between GDP and FDI. Miankel et al. 2009 adopt a time series framework of the VECM to study the dynamic relationship between export, FDI and GDP for 6 emerging countries of China, India, Mexico, Malaysia, Pakistan and Thailand, covering a period of 1970 to 2005. The results show growth of GDP attracted FDI, and the inflow of FDI further stimulate the growth of GDP. While Anwar and Muhammad 2020 examined co-integration and the causal relationship between FDI and GDP in both short and long run of Bangladesh, Pakistan and India over the period of 1972 to 2008. The result found that there is a significant relationship for both long run and short run of Pakistan. And lastly, Sandal Silar AR and Altiner A 2020 India end of study aiming to analyze the effect of FDI inflow on GDP growth in eco region show that FDI inflow has an utmost importance for the region. The result of the two causality tests notify a strong positive relation from FDI inflow to GDP. Despite the extensive research conducted on the relationship between GDP, inflation, exchange rate and FDI, several research gaps remain. Firstly, there is a need for further analysis to understand the specific mechanism through which inflation affects GDP growth. Secondly, further research may add other factors such as political condition or non-economic factors also may affect GDP.
Methods and econometric framework. Conceptual framework. According to the ACCA 2014, a conceptual framework is a collection of thoughts, percepts, and concepts that can help in understanding a subject or circumstance. In the social science, economic and business, conceptual framework organize the subject of studies and shape data analysis and interpretation. It assists researchers and professionals in comprehending challenging ideas and factors. The study-dependent variable is gross domestic product, while its independent variable are inflation rates, currency rates, and foreign direct investment. With the use of this conceptual framework, we can investigate how changes in currency, exchange, inflation, and foreign direct investment affect the GDP. Methodology. This study uses econometrics to examine the relationship between GDP and macroeconomics variables like inflation, currency rates, and FDI. The study estimates coefficient and analyzes the statistical significance of independent factor in GDP variation using oil as regression. The model equation used in this analysis is GDP equal to beta 0 plus beta 1 inflation plus beta 2 exchange rate plus beta 3 FDI plus epsilon. OLS regression analysis minimizes the sum of squared residual by estimating coefficient beta 0, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3 that fit the data. Hypothesis testing determines coefficient significance. The null hypothesis states that independent variables do not affect GDP, which means beta 1 is equal to beta 2 equal to beta 3. At least one coefficient is non-zero under the alternative hypothesis. Diagnostic tests are used to test the regression model assumption in addition to estimating coefficients. Normality tests, serial correlation tests, heteroscedasticity tests, and integration analysis are used to determine the long-term equilibrium relationship between GDP and independent variable. Data sources. The research used World Bank and UNTAC data from 1991 to 2021 to analyze macroeconomics indicator, ensuring consistency and reliability for meaningful conclusion on GDP and microeconomics determinants.
Hi, I am Nora Shikin binti Muhammad Norizan, and now we will continue the presentation about the results and discussion, which is the coefficient of variance (CV), ordinary least square test, normality test, serial correlation test, heteroscedasticity test, custom sum of square test, and co-integration analysis. The first one is coefficient of variance (CV). The functional forms that we use is linear forms, double log forms, log linear forms, and linear log forms. For the result, log linear has the lowest coefficient of variance, which is 0.0136. And the highest one is linear log forms, which is 4.0737. Although the log linear form has the lowest CV among all functional forms, it is not always the best or appropriate choice. So we use the double log form is employed in the studies OLS regressions. Next is ordinary least squares OLS test. For the results, the inflation variable has a negative coefficient of 0.4203. This implies that the 1 unit increase in inflation is related with a 0.4203 unit loss in GDP. The relationship is highly likely to be valid based on the statistically significant t-statistic of negative 3.255 and the low p-value of 0.003. Next, the exchange rate variable has a positive coefficient of 1.418. This means that 1 unit increase in the exchange rate corresponds to a 1.418 unit increase in GDP. The statistically significant t-statistics of 3.339 and the low p-value of 0.025 confirm this link strongly. The foreign direct investment (FDI) variable has a positive coefficient of 0.678. This means that the 1 unit increase in FDI corresponds to a 0.678 unit rise in GDP. For the overall, the OLS test findings indicate that the model fits the data reasonably well with statistically significant connection between GDP and the independent variables. Next is Jagpera normality test. For the hypothesis, the null hypothesis is residuals are normally distributed, and the alternative hypothesis is residuals are not normally distributed. The probability is 0.589404. The Jagpera statistic of 1.057 and its related probability value of 0.589 indicate the deviation from normalcy. The probability value in this situation is more than 0.05, suggesting that the data does not deviate significantly from a normal distribution at the standard significant level. Therefore, the results do not reject the null hypothesis. Next is serial correlation test. We have two, which is 3 legs and 4 legs. For the hypothesis, the null hypothesis is error terms are not correlated, and the alternative hypothesis is error terms are correlated. For the 3 legs, the probability f is 0.1643 and the probability chi-square is 0.1186. For the 3 legs, the result do not reject the null hypothesis because the probability f and the probability chi-square is more than 0.05. The result of the 3 legs serial correlation test indicate that there is no significant serial correlation in the regression model's residuals because error terms are not correlated. For the 4 legs, the probability f is 0.2148 and the probability chi-square is 0.1529. For the 4 legs, the result do not reject the null hypothesis because the probability f and the probability chi-square is more than 0.05. The results of the 4 legs serial correlation test indicate that there is no significant serial correlation in the regression model's residuals because error terms are not correlated.
My name is Dayang Nur Abida, and I will be presenting the heteroscedasticity test CUSUM and CUSUM sum of square test, and also the co-integration analysis. Hypothesis testing of these two tests, the null hypothesis assumes the variance of error terms are constant, while the alternative hypothesis assumes the variance of error terms are not constant. The probability value in the Bush-Pagan-Godfrey test is less than the standard significance level of 0.05, which shows that there is evidence of heteroscedasticity in the model. Therefore, we reject the null hypothesis, which indicates that the variance of the error terms are not constant. As for white test, the probability associated with the chi-squares show that heteroscedasticity exists. Therefore, the results reject the null hypothesis as the p-value is less than the significance level of 0.05 and indicates that the variance of error terms are not constant. Next, the CUSUM and the CUSUM sum of square test. The CUSUM-Ramsey reset test is a statistical test used to assess whether a linear regression model suffers from omitted variables or functional form misspecification. The null hypothesis assumes there is no misspecification in the model, while the alternative hypothesis assumes there is misspecification in the model. As all of the probabilities are greater than the significance level of 0.05, we do not reject the null hypothesis, which implies there is no misspecification in the model. The blue line represents the cumulative changes in the data, while the red line acts like a benchmark and serves as a reference point to compare the blue line against. For the CUSUM test, we reject the null hypothesis as exceeds or crosses the red line beyond the acceptable range, which suggests there evidence of structural change or instability in the residuals. As for the CUSUM sum of square test, we do not reject the null hypothesis as the blue line stays close to or intersect the red line within the acceptable range, which indicates that the residuals do not exhibit significant departures from the assumed model. Lastly, co-integration analysis. Two tests were run in this analysis, which are the unrestricted co-integration rank test based on the trace statistic and the unrestricted co-integration rank test based on the greatest eigenvalue. The null hypothesis of no co-integration is rejected by the trace statistic test at the 0.05 significance level. This implies that there is evidence of co-integration among the variables. Similarly, at the 0.05 significance level, the maximum eigenvalue test results reject the null hypothesis of no co-integration. Overall, these findings suggest that there is evidence of co-integration between GDP, inflation, exchange rates, and FDI, which implies that these variables have a stable long-term relationship.
In conclusion, this research set up use the existing data to gain insight into the connection between GDP, inflation, exchange rate, and foreign direct investment. This paper used a solid data from World Bank and UCAD gathered time series data covering Malaysia from 1991 to 2021. Besides that, we also employed ordinary least square OLS regression and a variety of statistical tests to investigate the relationship between GDP and its independent variable. We also using theory like marking seeking theory and inflation aversion theory. For recommendation, our group find numerous policy recommendations can be made to boost GDP growth, such as Al-Hassan 2022. Government should prioritize the policy that encourage investment and generate economic activity to trace back tax break. From the World Trade Organization 2022 that investing in education and skill training program can improve human capital and productivity. And lastly, Hanashik and Wusman 2015 point out infrastructure development, including transport, electricity, and digital network, is critical for promoting economic activity. That's all from our group. Thank you.
That is all for our presentation. Thank you.